How dare you speak back to me? My eyes! I cannot see! Mother of God, I can't see! Help my...
The grand ballroom of Ashford Manor blazed with 1,000 candles. Their light danced across polished marble floors, climbed velvet curtains the color of wine, and glittered against the jewels dripping from the throats of England's finest families. It was the spring of 1884, and the Ashford family was hosting the most anticipated event of the season, the betrothal announcement of Duke Edward Ashford, heir to one of the oldest titles in the realm. Edward stood near the eastern windows, tall and straight in his black evening coat and crisp white cravat. His dark curls were combed back, revealing a face that belonged on Roman coins. Strong jaw, sharp cheekbones, eyes the color of winter storms. He was 26 years old, educated at Cambridge, trained in law and languages, groomed since birth to inherit his father's duchy. And every woman in the room had looked at him, at least once that evening. Every mother with an unmarried daughter had tried to catch his eye, but Edward's gaze remained cold, distant. He held a glass of champagne, but hadn't tasted it. Beside him stood his mother, Queen Mother Margaret Harrowgate, a woman whose beauty had once stopped men in the street. Now, at 53, her face was still striking, but something hard had settled in her features. She wore a gown of deep crimson velvet, with a diamond and ruby tiara crowning her grey-streaked hair. Around her neck hung a necklace worth more than most families earned in a lifetime. Margaret had not been born into royalty. She had married into it, and she had clawed her way to power with a ruthlessness that shocked even those who knew her best. When Edward's father, the Duke, had died 3 years prior, Margaret had seized control of the household with an iron grip. She made decisions. She controlled the purse strings. She decided who was invited to dinner and who would be shunned. And most importantly, she would decide whom her son would marry. Across the ballroom, moving quietly between the clusters of lords and ladies, was a young woman in a plain grey dress. Her name was Catherine Wilcox, though everyone simply called her Cat. She was 19 years old, with auburn hair pinned back in a simple bun and green eyes that missed nothing. She carried a silver tray, balanced carefully in both hands, weaving through the crowd with practiced grace. Catherine was a maid. She had worked at Ashford Manor for 2 years, ever since her father, Albert Wilcox, a tenant farmer on the Ashford estate. They had fallen ill and could no longer work. The wages she earned kept her family fed. She sent most of her pay home each month. Her mother had died when Catherine was 12, leaving her to care for her younger brother and aging father. She had learned early in life that survival meant keeping your head down, your mouth shut, and your work flawless. The orchestra played a waltz. Couples glided across the floor in perfect time. Catherine moved along the edges of the room, offering glasses of champagne to guests. She had been trained never to make eye contact, never to speak unless spoken to, never to draw attention. She had become very good at being unseen. But tonight, something was different. Tonight, the Queen Mother seemed agitated. Catherine had noticed it earlier when she had been summoned to pour wine in the private drawing room. The Margaret had snapped at 2 other servants already, sending one girl away in tears. The staff whispered that the Queen Mother was displeased with the evening. Whispers also said she had been drinking more than usual. Catherine approached a table near the centre of the room, where Margaret stood speaking with Lady Beatrice Langham, a sharp-eyed widow, known for knowing everyone's secrets. The 2 women were discussing Edward's impending engagement to some earl's daughter from Cornwall, a match Margaret had arranged personally. The head butler, Thomas Whitby, had instructed Catherine to refill the champagne flutes on that table. She moved toward it silently, keeping her eyes lowered. As she reached for the first glass, her hand brushed against the stem of a different glass, one filled with burgundy instead of champagne. Margaret's voice cut through the music like a blade. "Why did you serve burgundy and crystal meant for champagne?" Catherine froze. She looked down at the glass in her hand. It was true. The burgundy had been placed in the wrong glass, but she had not done it. Someone else must have set it there before she arrived. She opened her mouth to explain, but Margaret spoke first. "Foolish child." The room seemed to grow quieter. Conversations near them began to falter. People turned to look. "No, please, Your Majesty. I did not know." Margaret's face darkened. Her eyes narrowed. She had been drinking steadily all evening, and the wine had loosened something dangerous inside her. For years, she had maintained perfect control over her household, her reputation, her power. But lately, cracks had begun to show. Her son had started questioning her decisions. The servants whispered about her temper. Tonight, in front of all these people, this common girl dared to speak back to her. What insolence is this? How dare you speak back to me? Margaret grabbed the glass from Catherine's hand, and in one swift motion struck the girl across the face with it. The crystal shattered against Catherine's cheekbone. Shards flew into her eyes. Red wine and blood mixed together, streaming down her face. Catherine screamed. Her hands flew to her face. The tray fell from her grip, crashing to the floor. The orchestra stopped playing. The entire ballroom went silent. "My eyes! I cannot see! Mother of God, I cannot see!" Catherine collapsed to her knees, blood pouring between her fingers. Women gasped. Men stepped forward, then hesitated. No one knew what to do. The Queen Mother stood frozen, the broken stem of the glass still in her hand, staring down at the girl she had just maimed. Edward had been across the room when it happened. He pushed through the crowd, his face white. He knelt beside Catherine, pulling a handkerchief from his pocket and pressing it gently against her face. "Do not move. Let me help you." His voice was steady, but his hands shook. He had seen violence before, in hunting accidents, in street brawls, but never something like this. Never something so deliberate, so cruel. He looked up at his mother. Margaret's face had gone pale. She dropped the broken glass and took a step back. Thomas Whitby appeared at Edward's side, along with Dr. Leonard Finch, the royal physician, who had been attending the ball as a guest. Dr. Finch examined Catherine's eyes with gentle, practiced hands. After a long moment, he looked up at Edward and shook his head. "The damage is severe, Your Grace. I fear she may never see again." A murmur swept through the crowd. Edward felt something cold settle in his chest. He had stood there. He had watched his mother lose her temper before, had seen her lash out at servants, and he had done nothing. He had let it happen because it was easier than confronting her, easier than risking her wrath. And now this girl, this innocent girl, would pay for his cowardice for the rest of her life. "Take her to the physician's room." Catherine was carried out by 2 footmen, still sobbing, still clutching her face. Blood dripped onto the marble floor, leaving a trail. The guests began to whisper among themselves. Margaret stood motionless, her face a mask of shock and something else. Fear. But the ball ended abruptly. Guests made their excuses and left in hurried clusters, their carriages rattling away into the night. By midnight, the manor was quiet except for the soft weeping coming from the physician's room. Edward paced the library. He could not sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Catherine's face, saw the blood, heard her screaming. Margaret sat in a high-backed chair near the fireplace, a glass of brandy in her hand. She had not spoken since the incident. Finally, Edward stopped pacing and turned to face her. "What have you done, Mother? What in God's name have you done?" Margaret looked up at him. Her eyes were red-rimmed, but her voice was cold. She was insolent. She needed to be taught a lesson. A lesson? You blinded her. You destroyed her life. Do you understand what you have done? Margaret stood, setting her glass down with a sharp clink. What I have done? What about what you have done, Edward? You stood there. You watched. You did nothing. And now every guest at that ball will talk. The scandal will spread across London. By morning, our family's name will be dragged through the mud. All because you could not control one simple servant. Edward stared at her, disbelief written across his face. She was blaming him. She had struck a girl, permanently disfigured her, and now she was blaming him for not preventing it. Before he could respond, the library door opened. Thomas Whitby entered, his face grave. Behind him stood Lord Reginald Ashford, Edward's uncle and the family solicitor. Reginald was a thin, grey-haired man with sharp features and sharper instincts. He had heard about the incident within an hour and had ridden through the night to reach the manor. Reginald closed the door behind him and looked from Edward to Margaret. "We have a problem, a very serious problem. By dawn, every newspaper in London will have this story. A queen mother striking a servant at her own ball. A young girl blinded for a minor mistake. The public will not forgive this. Parliament will not ignore it. There will be calls for your arrest, Margaret. Calls for your title to be stripped." Margaret's face went white. Edward felt his stomach turn. "What can we do?" Reginald pulled out a chair and sat down heavily. "There is one option, one way to salvage this situation and protect the family name. Edward, you must marry the girl." The room went silent. Edward stared at his uncle, as if the man had gone mad. "What?" "You will marry Catherine Wilcox. You will elevate her to the position of Duchess. You will make her family, and in doing so, you will show the world that the Ashford family takes responsibility for its actions. It will turn the scandal into a story of redemption, of nobility, of a duke who stood by an innocent woman wronged by his family." Edward shook his head, backing away. "I will not marry a servant. A blind, penniless girl with no breeding, no education, no." Reginald's voice turned hard. "Then you will lose everything. Your title, or your inheritance, your family name. Parliament is already drawing up charges against your mother. Assault, battery, disfigurement. She could be imprisoned. The Ashford estate could be seized. Everything your father built, everything your ancestors fought for, will be gone. Unless you do this one thing." Margaret spoke then, her voice barely a whisper. "Edward, please." He looked at her. For the first time in his life, he saw fear in his mother's eyes. Real, genuine fear. She knew what would happen to her if he refused. She knew she had gone too far this time. Edward closed his eyes. He thought of his father, of the legacy that had been passed down through generations. He thought of the servants who depended on the estate for their livelihoods. He thought of Catherine, lying in that room upstairs, her life destroyed because of his family's cruelty. And he thought of himself, of the man he had always believed himself to be, honorable, just, responsible. If he refused now, he would prove that he was none of those things. He opened his eyes. "I will do it. I will marry her. Hello, we love bringing these stories to you, but it is important that we receive your support through subscription, like, and comments in order to continue bringing you these unique and authentic contents so subscribe to see how this unfolds and comment where you are watching from. I would love to say hello to you just to know how far our story is going. The days that followed were a blur of preparations and negotiations. Catherine remained in the physician's room, her eyes bandaged, her world reduced to darkness and pain. Dr. Finch tended to her wounds with care, but there was little he could do. The glass had cut deep. The damage was permanent. Catherine had not been told about the marriage arrangement. Edward had insisted on waiting until she was strong enough to hear it. In the meantime, Reginald worked tirelessly to manage the scandal. He met with newspaper editors, with members of Parliament, with church officials. He spun the story carefully. The Duke, moved by compassion and honor, would marry the injured girl and provide for her family. It was unprecedented, certainly, but also deeply noble. The public reaction was mixed. Some praised Edward's decision as an act of true nobility. Others saw it as a desperate attempt to avoid scandal. But the plan worked. The calls for Margaret's arrest quieted. The Queen Mother withdrew from public life, retreating to a private estate in the countryside. She would never again hold the power she once had. 1 week after the incident, Edward finally entered the physician's room to speak with Catherine. She sat in a chair by the window, her face still bandaged, her hands folded in her lap. She turned her head when she heard the door open. "Who is there?" Her voice was soft, cautious. Edward's throat tightened. He had rehearsed this conversation a dozen times, but now that he was here, the words felt hollow. "It is Edward Ashford. I have come to speak with you." Catherine's hands clenched together. She had heard his voice that night, heard him trying to help her. But she also knew who he was, the son of the woman who had destroyed her life. "Your Grace, forgive me for not standing. I cannot see where the floor is." Well, Edward crossed the room and knelt beside her chair so that they were at the same height. "Please do not apologize. I am the one who should be apologizing. What happened to you was unforgivable. My mother's actions were inexcusable, and I am deeply, profoundly sorry." Catherine said nothing for a long moment. Then she spoke quietly. "Why have you come here, Your Grace? To offer me money? To send me away?" Edward hesitated. How could he possibly explain this to her? How could he tell her that he was about to turn her entire life upside down again? "I have come to ask you something. Something that will sound absurd, perhaps even cruel, given the circumstances. But I need you to hear me out." He took a deep breath. "I am asking you to marry me." Silence filled the room. Catherine's face went pale beneath the bandages. She must have misheard him. That was the only explanation. "I do not understand." Edward explained everything. The scandal, the threat to his family's name, the plan to salvage their reputation. He spoke quickly, trying to make her understand that this was not a proposal born of love or even affection, but of necessity. But as he spoke, he realized how horrible it sounded. He was asking her to give up any chance at a normal life, to become the wife of a man she barely knew, all to save a family that had already destroyed her. When he finished, Catherine sat very still. Her hands were trembling. "And if I refuse?" Edward's jaw tightened. He had hoped she would not ask that question. "If you refuse, my mother will likely be prosecuted. Our family will lose everything. And you will be left with nothing. No compensation, no support, or no means to care for yourself or your family." Catherine's breath caught. She thought of her father, struggling to survive on the tenant farm. She thought of her younger brother, who had no education, no prospects. If she refused, they would all suffer. But if she agreed, she would become part of the family that had hurt her. She would have to live with the woman who had blinded her. She would have to pretend that everything was fine. She turned her face toward the window, toward the sunlight she could no longer see. I do not have a choice, do I? Edward wanted to lie. He wanted to tell her that she did have a choice, that he would find another way. But he could not. Not when so much was at stake. No, I am afraid you do not. Catherine nodded slowly. A tear slipped from beneath the bandages and ran down her cheek. But Edward saw it and felt something crack inside him. He had never felt more ashamed in his entire life. Then I will do it. I will marry you. The wedding was arranged for 3 weeks later. It would be a small, private ceremony, nothing like the grand affair Edward's mother had once planned for him. Catherine was moved to a guest room in the manor, where she was fitted for a wedding gown by a seamstress who worked in silence, uncomfortable with the strange circumstances. Catherine learned to navigate her new world slowly, painfully. She had to relearn everything, how to dress herself, how to walk without stumbling, how to eat without spilling. A tutor was hired to teach her to read through touch, to recognize voices, to move with confidence despite her blindness. It was exhausting, humiliating work, but Catherine approached it with the same determination that had kept her family alive all these years. Edward visited her each day. At first, their conversations were stiff, formal. He asked about her comfort, her needs. She answered briefly, politely. But as the days passed, something began to shift. Edward found himself telling her about his childhood, about his father, about the weight of inheriting a title he had never wanted. Catherine, in turn, spoke about her family, about her mother's death, about the long nights she had worked to keep them all fed. They were two people trapped in circumstances neither had chosen, but slowly they began to understand each other. Edward saw in Catherine a strength he had never witnessed in the women of his social class. She did not complain, did not demand sympathy. She simply endured. And Catherine began to see that Edward was not the cold, arrogant man she had assumed him to be. He was burdened, yes, but he was also trying, in his own way, to do what was right. One afternoon, a week before the wedding, Edward found Catherine sitting in the garden. She had asked to be brought outside to feel the sun on her face. He approached quietly, not wanting to startle her. "May I join you?" She turned her head toward his voice and nodded. He sat beside her on the stone bench. For a while, neither of them spoke. The garden was quiet except for the sound of birds and the distant murmur of the estate workers. "I used to come here as a child," Catherine said suddenly. "Your father employed my father as a gardener before he became a tenant farmer. I would play among the roses while my father worked. I never imagined I would return here like this." Edward looked at her, surprised. He had not known that. He hadn't known anything about her life before she became a maid. "I am sorry for all of this. I know saying it doesn't change anything, but I need you to know that I am sorry." Catherine was quiet for a moment. Then she reached out, her hand searching the air until it found his. She took his hand gently. "I know you are, Your Grace, and I believe you mean it. But we cannot change what has happened. We can only decide what we do next." Edward looked down at their joined hands. Her fingers were small, calloused from years of work. His were smooth, pampered. Yet in that moment, he felt an unexpected connection, a shared understanding that they were both victims of circumstances larger than themselves. "What do you want to do next?" he asked softly. Catherine smiled faintly. It was the first time he had seen her smile since the night of the ball. I want to survive. I want my family to be safe. And perhaps someday I want to forgive. But I am not there yet. Edward nodded, though she could not see it. I understand. And I will do everything in my power to help you get there. The wedding day arrived on a cold, grey morning. The ceremony was held in the Manor's private chapel, attended only by a handful of people: Reginald, Thomas Whitby, Dr. Finch, Lady Beatrice Langham, and Catherine's father, Albert, who had been brought from the tenant farm. He was thin and frail, his face lined with worry and grief. But when he saw his daughter in her wedding gown, tears streamed down his cheeks. Margaret was not present. She had sent word that she was too ill to attend. Though everyone knew the truth, she could not face what she had done. She remained in her countryside estate, exiled by her own shame. Catherine wore a simple white gown with lace sleeves. Her hair was pinned up, and a veil covered her bandaged eyes. She looked fragile, ethereal, like a ghost bride. Edward stood at the altar in his formal black coat, his face somber. When Catherine was led down the aisle by her father, Edward felt his resolve waver. This was wrong. Everything about this was wrong. But it was also the only way forward. The priest spoke the words of the ceremony. Edward repeated his vows in a steady voice. Catherine spoke hers quietly, her hands trembling. When the priest pronounced them husband and wife, Edward lifted the veil carefully and saw her face, still marked by the bandages that covered her ruined eyes. He leaned forward and kissed her gently on the forehead, unable to bring himself to kiss her lips. It felt too intimate, too false, and just like that, Catherine Wilcox became Catherine Ashford, Duchess of Ashford, one of the most powerful women in England. A woman who could not see the world she now ruled. The first months of their marriage were strange and difficult. Catherine moved into the Duchess's chambers, a suite of rooms larger than any house she had ever lived in. Servants attended to her every need, but she found their constant presence suffocating. She missed her independence, missed the simplicity of her old life. Edward maintained a respectful distance. They shared meals together, attended to estate business, but they did not share a bed. Edward had insisted on separate sleeping arrangements, wanting to give Catherine space, wanting to preserve what little dignity she had left. But the arrangement only served to highlight the strangeness of their situation. They were married, but not truly husband and wife. Society's reaction to the marriage was mixed. Some praised Edward for his nobility. Others whispered that he had been trapped, that the marriage was a farce. Invitations to social events dwindled. The Ashford name, once synonymous with prestige, now carried a hint of scandal. Edward bore it stoically, but Catherine felt the weight of it every day. One evening, 3 months after the wedding, Catherine sat in the drawing room, her fingers moving over a book written in raised letters. She was learning to read again, this time through touch. It was slow, frustrating work, but she was determined to master it. She would not let her blindness make her helpless. Edward entered the room and paused when he saw her. She looked so focused, so determined. It reminded him of the first time he had seen her after the accident, sitting in the physician's room, with her hands folded in her lap, refusing to crumble. "May I ask what you are reading?" Catherine looked up, startled. She had not heard him come in. "It is a book of poetry. Wordsworth. My tutor suggested it to help me practice." Edward crossed the room and sat in the chair opposite her. "Do you enjoy it?" Catherine hesitated, then nodded. "I do. It reminds me that there is beauty in the world, and even if I cannot see it, Edward felt something stir in his chest. He had spent so much time feeling guilty, feeling responsible, that he had not stopped to see the person Catherine was becoming. She was not just a victim. She was a survivor. Would you read some to me, if it is not too much trouble? Catherine's lips curved into a small smile. Of course, Your Grace. Edward. Please call me Edward. She nodded slowly. Edward, then. She began to read, her fingers tracing the raised letters with careful precision. Her voice was soft, melodic. Edward listened, and for the first time since the night of the ball, he felt something other than guilt. He felt hope. From that evening on, they began spending more time together. Edward would visit her in the drawing room each night, and they would talk about books, about philosophy, about the world beyond the manor's walls. Catherine had a sharp mind, and Edward found himself genuinely enjoying their conversations. She challenged him in ways no one else ever had. Slowly, the formality between them began to dissolve. Catherine started calling him Edward without hesitation. Edward began to see her not as a burden or a responsibility, but as a person he genuinely respected. And then one day, something shifted again. It happened on a rainy afternoon. Catherine had asked to walk in the garden despite the weather, and Edward had accompanied her. They stood beneath a covered pavilion, listening to the rain drum against the roof. Catherine tilted her face upward, feeling the cool mist on her skin. I used to love the rain, she said quietly. I would stand outside and let it soak me through. My mother would scold me for it, but I did not care. Edward watched her, and something in his chest tightened. She looked so peaceful, so content, despite everything she had lost. He took a step closer. You can still do that, you know. No one will stop you. Catherine laughed softly. I think the Duchess of Ashford standing in the rain would cause quite the scandal. Edward smiled. Let them talk. We have weathered worse. Catherine turned toward him, her face serious. Have we? Weathered it, I mean. Or are we simply pretending? The question hung in the air between them. Edward thought about it carefully. Were they pretending? Was this marriage nothing more than a performance for the benefit of society? I do not know, he admitted. But I would like to find out. Catherine reached out, her hand searching the space between them. Edward took it gently, his fingers closing around hers. So would I. From that day forward, their relationship began to change. It was subtle at first, a touch that lingered a moment too long, a conversation that stretched late into the night, a shared glance that meant more than words could say. Edward found himself thinking about Catherine when she was not around, wondering what she was doing, whether she was happy. And Catherine, for the first time since her injury, began to feel something other than pain and loss. She began to feel hope. And then, slowly, carefully, she began to feel something more. 6 months after their wedding, Edward entered Catherine's chambers one evening to find her standing by the window, her hand pressed against the glass. She had removed her bandages weeks ago, revealing the scars left by the shattered crystal. Her eyes were clouded, unseeing, but she held her head high. Is something wrong? Edward asked gently. Catherine shook her head. No, I was just thinking about how much my life has changed. 6 months ago, I was a maid. Now I am a duchess. I should feel grateful. I should feel fortunate. But instead, I just feel lost. Edward crossed the room and stood beside her. You are not alone in that feeling. She turned toward him, her face searching for his, even though she could not see it. Do you ever regret it? Marrying me? Edward's throat tightened. It was a question he had asked himself many times in the early days of their marriage. But now, standing here with her, he knew the answer. Number 1. I do not regret it. Not anymore. Catherine's breath caught. She had not expected that answer. She had thought, perhaps hoped, or that he might say something kind, something reassuring. But the certainty in his voice was something more. Why not? Edward reached out and took her hand. Her skin was warm against his. Because you have taught me what true strength looks like. You have shown me more courage, more grace, more dignity than anyone I have ever known. And because when I am with you, I feel like the man I always wanted to be. Tears welled in Catherine's eyes and spilled down her cheeks. Edward reached up and gently wiped them away. She leaned into his touch, and he felt his heart break and heal at the same time. I am falling in love with you, Catherine. I didn't plan it. I didn't expect it. But it is true. Catherine's hands trembled as she reached up and found his face, her fingers tracing the lines of his jaw, his cheekbones, his lips. No, she had never seen him. But now she saw him in a different way. She saw him through touch, through sound, through the warmth of his presence. I think I am falling in love with you too. Edward leaned forward and kissed her. It was not like the chaste kiss he had given her on their wedding day. This kiss was real, filled with months of longing and hope, and something fragile and new. Catherine kissed him back, her hands tangling in his hair, pulling him closer. When they finally pulled apart, both were breathless. Edward rested his forehead against hers, his hands cradling her face. We can make this real, Catherine. We can build a life together, a real marriage, if you want that. Catherine smiled through her tears. I want that. More than anything. From that night forward, their marriage became something neither of them had expected. It became a partnership built on mutual respect, on shared pain, and on a love that had grown from the ashes of tragedy. Edward moved into Catherine's chambers, and for the first time, they truly became husband and wife in every sense of the word. The months that followed were not easy. Society still whispered. Margaret remained in exile, a broken woman, haunted by her own cruelty. But Edward and Catherine faced it all together. They attended events as a united front. Catherine learned to navigate social situations with grace, and Edward stood by her side, proudly introducing her as his wife. Catherine also began to use her position to help others. She established a school for blind children on the estate, teaching them the skills she had learned. She worked with Dr. Finch to improve medical care for tenants. Now she became known not as the Blind Duchess, but as a woman of strength and compassion. 1 year after their wedding, Catherine discovered she was with child. The news brought both joy and fear. She worried about bringing a child into a world she could not see, about being a mother when she herself felt so fragile. But Edward reassured her, and together they prepared for the arrival of their first child. On a spring morning, exactly 2 years after the night of the ball, Catherine gave birth to a healthy baby girl. Edward was there when she was born, holding Catherine's hand as she brought new life into the world. When the baby was placed in Catherine's arms, she wept. She could not see her daughter's face, but she felt the warmth of her tiny body, heard the soft cries, and knew that she was perfect. They named her Grace. Grace Ashford, a name that meant forgiveness, redemption, and hope. Margaret received word of the birth from Reginald. She sat alone in her countryside estate, staring at the letter. She had lost everything, her power, her reputation, her family. But this letter, this news of a grandchild she would never meet, broke something inside her that had not yet broken. She wrote a letter to Edward. It was the first communication she had sent since her exile. In it, she apologized. not with excuses or justifications, but with raw, honest remorse. She acknowledged what she had done to Catherine, what she had taken from her, and she begged for forgiveness, knowing she did not deserve it. Edward read the letter aloud to Catherine one evening as they sat together in the nursery, watching their daughter sleep. When he finished, Catherine was quiet for a long time. "Oh, do you think she means it?" Edward asked. Catherine reached out and found his hand. "I think she is finally understanding what she lost. Not just her power or her reputation, but her family, her son, her grandchild." Edward looked down at their joined hands. "Can you forgive her?" Catherine was silent for a long moment. Then she spoke softly. "I do not know if I can forgive her completely. Not yet. But I think I can try. For Grace, for our family, and for myself. Because holding on to anger is like carrying a stone in my heart, and I am tired of the weight." Edward squeezed her hand gently. "Then we will try together." A month later, Margaret was invited to visit the manor. It was a small, private visit, just her, Edward, and Catherine. Margaret arrived in a simple carriage, dressed plainly, her face lined with age and sorrow. When she entered the drawing room and saw Catherine holding Grace, she stopped in her tracks. The two women stared at each other, or rather, Margaret stared while Catherine turned her head toward the sound of footsteps. The silence stretched on, heavy with everything that had been said and left unsaid. Finally, Margaret spoke, her voice trembling. "I am sorry. I know those words cannot undo what I did. I know they cannot give you back what you lost. But I need you to know that I am truly, deeply sorry." Catherine's face remained calm, composed. She held Grace a little tighter. "I lost my sight because of you. I lost my independence, my sense of safety, my ability to move through the world the way I once did. Those are things I will never get back." Margaret's eyes filled with tears. She nodded, unable to speak. "But I also gained something I never expected. I gained a husband who loves me. I gained a daughter who is the light of my life. I gained a purpose that I would never have found otherwise. So while I cannot forgive you for what you took, I can acknowledge what came from it. And perhaps one day, that will be enough." Margaret sank into a chair, her hands covering her face as she wept. Edward stood beside Catherine, his hand on her shoulder. It was not forgiveness, not yet, but it was a beginning. Over the next several years, Margaret slowly rebuilt her relationship with her son, and, to a lesser extent, with Catherine. She would never be the powerful queen mother she once was, but she found peace in being a grandmother to Grace, and later, to Grace's younger brother, Albert, named after Catherine's father. Catherine's School for Blind Children grew, becoming one of the most respected institutions of its kind in England. She became a voice for those who had been overlooked, using her position to advocate for better treatment of servants, for educational opportunities for the poor, for medical care for those who could not afford it. Her blindness, which had once seemed like the end of her life, became the lens through which she saw the world's injustices more clearly than most. Edward stood by her side through it all. He managed the estate with fairness and wisdom, but it was Catherine who gave him purpose. She reminded him that power was not about control, but about service. That nobility was not about titles, but about character. One evening, 10 years after the night of the ball, Nick Edward and Catherine sat together in the garden where they had once stood in the rain. Their children played nearby, their laughter echoing through the roses. Catherine's hair had streaks of grey now, and Edward's face had lines that spoke of years well lived. "Do you ever think about that night?" Edward asked quietly. Catherine nodded. "I do. but not with the same pain I once felt. Now, when I think about it, I think about what came after. I think about us, about our children, about the life we built from something so broken. Edward took her hand and kissed it gently. I love you, Catherine. More than I thought it was possible to love anyone. Catherine smiled, turning her face toward the sound of his voice. And I love you, Edward. You gave me back my life when I thought it was over. You showed me that even in the darkest moments, there is always hope. They sat together in comfortable silence, their hands joined, their hearts intertwined. The scars of the past had not disappeared, but they had healed. And from those scars had grown something beautiful, something enduring. Before we end this story, I want to ask you something important. This story, like all the stories we bring to you, takes time, research, and care to create. If you enjoyed it, if it moved you, if it made you think, please take a moment to subscribe to this channel. Your subscription helps us continue creating these unique narratives that explore the depths of human emotion, resilience, and love. And please, leave a comment below telling us where you are watching from. We would love to connect with you and know that our stories are reaching people around the world. Thank you for being part of this journey with us. The story of Catherine and Edward Ashford became legend in England. It was told and retold, a tale of cruelty transformed into compassion, of tragedy redeemed by love. It served as a reminder that even the darkest moments can give birth to light, that even the most broken people can find healing. Years later, when Grace was grown and married herself, she asked her mother about that night. They sat together in the same drawing room where Catherine had once learned to read by touch. Mother, do you wish it had never happened? That you had never been hurt? Catherine thought carefully before answering. She was older now, her hair completely white, but her spirit remained unbroken. I wish the cruelty had never happened. I wish your grandmother had chosen kindness instead of anger. But I do not wish away what came after. Your father, you, your brother, the work we have done together. These things are precious to me, and they would not exist without that night. Grace nodded, understanding. Life was not about avoiding pain, but about what you built from it. So the story ends where it began, with a choice. Margaret chose cruelty, and it destroyed her. Edward chose responsibility, and it redeemed him. Catherine chose resilience, and it transformed her. And together, Edward and Catherine chose love, and it gave them a life worth living. The lesson of their story is this: we cannot always control what happens to us, but we can control what we do with it. We can choose bitterness or growth, revenge or forgiveness, despair or hope. And sometimes, the greatest love stories are not the ones that begin with passion, but the ones that are forged through hardship, tempered by time, and strengthened by choice. Catherine Ashford, the blind duchess who had once been a servant, became one of the most beloved figures in Victorian England. Her legacy lived on through the schools she founded, the lives she changed, and the children she raised. And when she died, many years later, with Edward by her side and her family surrounding her, her last words were these: I cannot see the world, but I have seen enough. I have seen love. I have seen kindness. I have seen what it means to be truly alive, and that is more than enough. And with those words, she passed peacefully, leaving behind a world that was better because she had been in it. Thank you for staying with us to the end. We hope you end it and also learnt from it. Until next time. But we will see you in the next story. Don't forget to leave us a comment. Thank you. Bye.